Ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again to Room for Discussion. Today we are honored to have, for the first time on our platform, Dr. Werner Hoyer, President of the European Investment Bank. Mr. Werner Hoyer has had several roles throughout his life, from professor of political economy to leader of one of the main political parties in Germany. Today, however, we'll focus on the institution he currently heads, the EIB, which holds assets worth almost 6 billion euros, 600 billion euros. So in the first part of the interview, we'll discuss the mission and the functions of the European Investment Bank, and later we'll discuss some macroeconomic challenges and how the EIB fits in the picture of resolving them. As it is traditional room for discussion, you, the audience, will have the opportunity to engage with our guests and ask questions. So when the time comes, Sarah over there with the microphone will be there. Raise your hand and Sarah will be there to assist you. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Mr. Werner Hoyer.
Thank you very much. Does that sit all right? That's wonderful.
Yeah, that's great.
Comfy.
Good to hear. It's very great to have you here on our stage today. To begin with you personally, you follow the tradition of European politicians moving from the domestic politics to the European stage. Back at the time, what motivated this transition for you?
Well, I was in Parliament for 25 years and in government in a ministerial position for 7 years, and I saw this opportunity coming up and I said, okay, I'm not growing younger, so it's time to do something new and take up a new challenge. And that role as President of the European Investment Bank really fascinated me because, to put it in a nutshell, the European Investment Bank is the last undetected treasure of the European integration process.
Yeah, what did you mean by that? Yeah.
It's relatively unknown. Go to the street and ask people what they know about this EU institution, EIB. They will not very much, they'll say. And this is pretty harmful, in my view, at a time when there are so many bad stories told about Europe that if you have a good story to tell, then tell it. And this is what we are trying to do now. This is why I'm here. I have a good story to tell.
You believe that's not happening enough at this moment?
Of course, we are trying to do it enough, but, well, of course, I'll come to that in a second. But I believe, all in all, we forget to tell the good stories about Europe. We have very many reasons to be critical, to have negative stories. But the European political leaders, they must know that they have an instrument, a financial instrument in their hands, a tool that they can use. And I can tell you about a European Council 5 years ago when I presented a project of the bank or a policy issue. And during the coffee break, one head of state or prime minister took me to the side and said, Werner, after the coffee break, you must correct your figures. If your figures were right, that would mean you are bigger than the World Bank. I said, for heaven's sake, you must know that. We are 2.5 times the size of the World Bank.
Yes.
So political leaders in Europe must know that they have an instrument they can bring to bear. And this is why we need to tell our stories better.
Yeah, you say untapped treasure of European integration. You said it before as well. Is it not really strange that we hear much less then about the European Investment Bank than, let's say, the World Bank? As you say, we have a balance sheet 2.5 times as large, and it's much more relevant for us Europeans, right? So why do we hear much less about the EIB than the World Bank?
Well, that is a very justified question. On the other hand, I respect and highly value the work of the World Bank. It's a different business model. It's a different project profile. The World Bank is dealing with very granular projects on the ground in developing countries with lots of staff. Just to give you an example, the World Bank has roughly 18,000 people, and they're doing around about 40 billion of investment financing per year. We are doing 85 billion with 3,500 people. So that means we are a very lean institution. But still, I insist that I also came here because I want young economic students to know that this institution exists. We need people. So once you're done, think about it.
As you mentioned, the World Bank and your bank have very different goals. For example, it is part of your core idea of your bank to further European integration and social cohesion. Why is it so important to have this as its core?
Well, the bank was founded in the Treaty of Rome. That is almost 61 years ago. And in the Treaty of Rome, the bank was established for a purpose. Just imagine the situation in the mid-50s. Europe was still a shambles after the destruction of World War II. So infrastructure needed to be rebuilt or built anew and financed. And in addition to that, the then beginning European Economic Community, community of 6, had regions which did not benefit from the blessings of the Marshall Plan. For instance, Il Mezzogiorno was trailing far behind the rest of this European community, and therefore the idea was to set up something, a bank that would have two purposes. Number one, develop a common market. At that time, a sensational idea, a common market. And secondly, try to level out regional differences in the European Union, European communities at that time. And if you look at it with open eyes, you will see that this job has not been fully done.
Yeah.
Only roughly 50% of our GDP is produced and distributed along the rules of a common market.
Yeah.
Only 50%. And look at the regional differences in Europe, they are still enormous. So these objectives are still there. But in addition to that, the European Council over the decades has defined jobs for the bank that it should do. Nobody in the 1950s would have thought about climate change. Nobody would have thought about alternative energies and so forth. So this is the new challenge.
So you talk about economic divergence in the European Union. Do you think that you are successful in bringing economies more together when we talk about how differently developed they are and what type of stage they are?
Yes and no. You can still say that now in the upcoming Italian elections, next topic next week, the Mezzogiorno is still a region of great concern, obviously, for economic reasons and social reasons. Yeah. And you have other regions in Europe, in particular in southeastern and eastern Europe, where the entire European integration process and unification process has not been digested yet fully. So we really have a job to do there. That has remained. So I wouldn't say we are not successful. Look at in crisis times, for instance, when countries like Ireland, Greece, Portugal were in deepest trouble, the bank was extremely active there, and or Cyprus, a country that I think we brought out of the crisis, but now we have 16% of Cyprus GDP in our portfolio. So it is a huge effort that has been done.
Yeah. Could you in short then describe to the audience what are the most common means used by the bank to accomplish all these objectives?
I have another good story. We don't spend public money, with a few exceptions. Over the decades, the member states of the European Union have paid in only 14 billion euros, which maintains a balance sheet of 600 billion euros, and we have roughly 500 billion euros of EIB bonds flying around the world.
So it's a bank. It's
a bank. Yeah. We are a bank, a bank, and a bank. And sometimes I tell people who think that we are doing good things, projects of public or common interest, I still want the money back, and normally with interest rates. So we are a bank, and we need to go to the capital markets every year to borrow money between 70 and 90 billion euros per year in form of EIB bonds. And you must have the trust of the investors who give you the money. Why should they give you the money if they cannot expect to get their money back? So we have to ensure the quality of the projects, and we don't finance states, we only finance projects, concrete projects for which our engineers and economists and lawyers give their approval stamp.
Do your lenders give you do you give your lenders higher interest rate than the market, or lower, or how is that set up?
No, we are financing very, very cheaply because so far we have the trust of the markets.
Of course.
And nowadays, if you look at the situation of everybody who swims in money, and some people on this world are swimming in money, and insurance companies and sovereign wealth funds, they're swimming in money, they are glad to find a place where they get a little bit of interest rate. So if they can get a little bit of interest rate plus a safe return one day, then they are ready to do that. So we are financing in comparison, let's say, to the federal government of Germany.
Mm-hmm. And to see and to test what sort of standards you apply to see if a project is fulfilling your goal, what sort of standards do you apply to see if a project is fulfilling this goal of European integration?
Well, first of all, we say projects that we finance must be economically viable, and they must be sustainable.
course.
And then, of course, it has to be clear that we are an institution that is part of the EU setup, and we are responsible vis-à-vis the European public, the taxpayer, vis-à-vis the Parliament, the Council, the Commission, the Court of Justice, and so forth. So we have to make sure that EU law is applied. So when we are expected to finance a project that is not in line with EU criteria, then we are not allowed to finance it. And that goes from social criteria to environmental standards and things like that. Procurement rules must be obeyed. So sometimes that brings us into a difficult competition situation with other banks, public banks, which are not underlying the rules of the European Union.
Which other public banks?
Well, public banks can be from outside, like take the World Bank, take the big international multilateral banks, of which we are part. But we don't do business in the European Union only. We also do business outside the European Union, and there, of course, we must compete in order to bring the role of the European Union to bear.
Maybe interesting to get a picture of what kind of projects you do. Could you give the audience an example, one that you're maybe really proud of, that's really fulfilling this criteria of European integration and social cohesion?
Well, on cohesion, you have projects, and we are really going for it, that connects Europe. Connecting Europe facility, that the transportation project in particular, that is key for us. And there, we have still a lot to do. Just take one example that now will see the light of day. That is the interconnection between the Iberian Peninsula and France. For decades, it has not been possible to organize that. But if we want to set up a real pan-European energy market, we must also connect this part of Europe, Spain and Portugal, to France. This is one of the projects where you can really see the European content in it. But then, again, it would not be fair to single out projects, because each and every of these projects must fulfill the criterion of being in the interest of the European Union and in helping to further integrate the European Union.
I see you have all these criteria, of course, like sustainability and social cohesion, that helps you decide on a project. But in many cases, there is, of course, political uncertainty. You mentioned in a speech last year that your bank is looking to finance more projects in Ireland, because Ireland is going to be, of course, hit the most by Brexit. Is your bank always this responsive to this sort of political and economic turmoil?
Yes, we have to. We are a bank that has to pursue political goals set by the European Council.
Yeah.
And this unfortunate decision of Brexit, for me, the most stupid decision taken after World War II, will lead to big trouble for people all around Europe, but in particular for the British and the Irish people. And I still do not see how it's going to work to maintain the integrity of the total United Kingdom, to maintain the integrity of Ireland as part of the European Union, and keep Ireland, the entire
within the
island,
single market, right?
in the single market,
Yeah.
and keep the entire island undivided by a customs border, because that is threatening there. And so it takes the squaring the circle, and if the Irish business is severely hurt, we are ready to step in.
Yeah, the Irish case, the equation seems to be unable to be solved. It seems also that your bank is going to be hit also hard by Brexit, right? Your balance sheet is gonna go down significantly because of Brexit, right?
It's a terrible hit for us.
Yeah.
You know, if you're all economists, you know what that means. We are suffering from inverse leveraging. I told you about the relationship between the 40 billion really cashed in and the 600 billion assets. Now, this is done by leveraging. Now, let's take the other way out. The United Kingdom will not get very much money back. Only the cashed in they will get back. But the overall commitment of the United Kingdom is almost 40 billion euros for projects that have been decided over the last decades. And that commitment will remain, but it does not count as the capital base. So we are normally able and allowed to lend a volume of 2.5 times the overall capital, that is the paid-in capital, the reserves, and the callable capital, the contingent liability of the member states. That is at 240 billion euros, So if you take 40 billion out of these 240,
Which is the percentage of British paid-in capital, right?
of British callable capital.
Callable
And
capital.
if you multiply that by 2.5, then you arrive at a reduction of the maximum lending space of 100 billion euros.
Yeah.
And that hurts severely in those countries who need us most.
Yeah. So you're clearly responding to the case of Ireland, as you just said.
Well, Ireland is a success story, I must say.
Yeah.
The way the economic crisis in Ireland has been handled was really a success story, just like Cyprus is, just like Portugal is. And I hope, and I'm confident, Greece will be as well. So we will not let drop Ireland.
Yeah, but Greece's unemployment level, if you talk about Greece, it's still at 22%, and its private sector is badly in need for credit at this moment. Why then has, as a total percentage of funding, your funding to Greece gone down from 3.8% in 2010 until 3.4% last year? It should have gone up then, right, if you want to be more responsive to shocks in the Eurozone.
Yeah, but this is very short-term development. All in all, the
4 years.
The Greek business is enormous. You have to always put it into relationship with GDP, and I don't have the exact figures on my memory. I would say roughly 10% of our exposure in Greece represents roughly 10% of Greece.
So it's
GDP.
because of their GDP has gone down that you are also providing less funding to the country. Is that it?
We are not really giving less money. We have, projects always go over many years. So sometimes you have an approval of a project, but the money will flow only the year after, or 2 years after, or 3 years after. So you have to see it over a longer period. So you have to compare, let's say, at least 5 years.
You are looking for projects.
Sorry?
You are looking for projects then.
Oh, definitely. In Greece, we have somewhat changed the business model of the bank. Normally, EIB is a highly centralized bank in Luxembourg. We only have roughly 100 people outside of Luxembourg around the world. For Greece, we have made it now differently. We have a dedicated investment team for Greece of roughly 30 people who are really going for business. You have to detect, you have to find, you have to go for the intelligent, fascinating entrepreneurs in Greece, and they exist also in Greece.
Yeah, so I understand because your lending activities have gone up after the crisis, but still, as a percentage of total funding, you're lending less to Greece proportionally. So should you not maybe then lend less to the Netherlands, who's now in an economic boom, who doesn't really need that funding, respectively, to Greece, right?
That is a conclusion that is pretty near. On the other hand, presently our business in the Netherlands is a record high, and today I signed a contract with ING, which shows that even the Netherlands can use the support of the EU bank, because otherwise the project would not come about. It is about, this project here today is about the financing of green shipping. Shipping is one of the most polluting activities we allow ourselves in the world. And you know it from the Dutch ports, how bad it can be. And I'm in preparation for the Ocean Summit in next month in Mexico. And there you can see we must begin to clean up the ocean and the air around the oceans. And therefore, retrofitting polluting vessels is an extremely important issue, and it's one of the priorities of the European Union.
Okay.
And therefore, we are financing that, and the best banks for that purpose are, to a large extent, in the Netherlands.
I understand. And if we reflect again on your main mission, European integration, we can also take maybe a quick look at Poland, because Poland is the 6th largest recipient of your funds. However, with the new government, the Law and Justice Party, it has gone backwards on European ideals. Since the fact that they only seem to want to reap the benefits from the EU and not to share in its costs, don't you think then that they should be cut back from part of that funding?
Well, I can only say that the situation in Poland and also in Hungary is a great reason to worry.
Yeah, dramatic.
Dramatic, and I hope that our political leaders will use the necessary convincing arguments in order to reverse that trend, because otherwise we are destroying also a great success story to which we are attached.
Yes.
Because our activities in Poland have been developing fantastically over the last years, and I would not want to see that stop, because the economic development of Poland is a great achievement.
Right, Eastern Europe has been a growth miracle, right, of the European Union, a success story, you could even say.
At least in big parts of Eastern Europe.
Yes.
The differences are still enormous. You have the enormous progress in Slovakia or the Czech Republic and so forth. On the other hand, Romania are still lagging far behind. And not necessarily always for economic reasons. It's very often administrative and political.
But would you like to respond to that turmoil in Poland, or would you rather, in this case, distinguish economic and political motives?
It is our duty to be in line with EU policies. So if the European Union, if the European Council decide to take action against a member state, then it would apply for us as well. Look, the clearest example was a couple of years ago when the European Council decided on sanctions against Russia after the invasion of part of Ukraine. The bank had to stop immediately its activities in Russia, which, by the way, were fascinating because what we were financing in Russia was in particular environmentally upgrading buildings, and secondly, the Partnership for Modernization of Russia. And that had to stop from one day to the other. Other multilateral banks were able to continue in Russia as long as the United States did not say no. But we are bound only by what the EU says.
I understand.
Yeah, in the past, the EIB, as you said, primarily focused on infrastructure, especially after the Treaty of Rome. However, nowadays it finances a wide variety of activities, such as SMEs and venture capital. What circumstances led to the bank to change its priorities?
Objective needs and political will. When people got aware of the environmental crisis, it was evident that the European Council would say, okay, what can you do about it? So financing alternative energies or energy efficiency measures with buildings and vessels and other things, that went without saying that we did to a large extent. The same is true for climate change mitigation and adaptation, which has become a real priority. And the EU Bank was the driving force behind the multilateral banks when it came to the Paris Agreement 2.5 years ago. So we are deeply committed to that. 25% of our lending must be climate relating in the European Union. We made 27 in last year. And outside the European Union, by 2020, we must achieve 35%. That's the real challenge. Then one area that concerns me most in Europe is innovation. Financing of new products, new production processes, and translating that into competitiveness of Europe. We are falling behind. We have been inward looking in the European Union for the last 10 years, only dealing with concerns about the euro, but forgetting about our competitiveness and forgetting about pushing new ideas through. So financing of education, research and development and innovation must be given a higher priority in the Union. And last but not least, let me say on SMEs, that's a surprising thing. Every year we finance roughly 350,000 SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. And that is obviously the reaction to a failure of the banking, the financing system in Europe. Because indeed, even in a rich country like this one, access to finance for a small business owner is a real challenge. Yeah. And that has something to do with the fact that we have a different financing culture on this continent. Roughly 75% of all corporate financing in the EU comes from banks. In the US, 75% of corporate financing comes from the capital markets. So we need to develop equity products and things like that in order to at least close that gap a little bit between North America and Europe.
I see one of the important plans that that the Commission has come up with is the Juncker plan. The EU's Commission plan to increase investment spending in Europe from 2015 to 2018. Do you consider this a defining moment in the changing role of the European Investment Bank?
I think so, because it has changed the DNA of the bank. But since you mentioned the Juncker plan, let me tell an interesting audience how the Juncker plan came about. It was roughly 4 years ago, Mr. Juncker, and that was not foreseen in the history of Luxembourg, had lost an election. He had been Prime Minister or Finance Minister of Luxembourg for 25 years, roughly. And he was then thinking about a new role in the European Union. And he was developing ideas for his candidacy for the European People's Party for the presidency of the European Commission. And of course, he knows our bank inside out over these 25 years as the boss in Luxembourg. And he discussed with us what must be the priorities. And we detected and quantified the investment gap in Europe. And said, well, isn't it a phenomenon that we have an investment gap which we calculated at 700 billion euros per year at that time, simply by comparing the objectives set by the European Council, for instance, for education or innovation, comparing that with the money provided in public and corporate budgets until 2020. And this brought the number of 700 billion per year. So is it remarkable that you have an investment gap of 700 billion euros per year, and at the same time we have zero interest rates. We have abundant liquidity in the markets. How come that this money does not flow into these productive purposes that are there because the projects are available?
Yeah.
So it must
QE was not responsive, you believe?
No, QE was very helpful in my view, but QE, you can bring the horse to the water, but the horse must drink.
Yes.
And the horse didn't drink, and why didn't they do it? Because they were risk averse. They were uncertain about the future, they were skeptical, and they didn't fully believe in the projects. So the idea was then to say, well, why don't we encourage the potential investors in going into these fields by saying, okay, if you take that risk, we are ready to participate with the first slice of that risk if something goes wrong. And that has made a tremendous change for us, because with the shift of 16 billion of budget money in the European budget from subsidies and grants to guarantees and loans, plus 5 billion that the EU bank put on top of it, 25 billion as a guarantee facility, we are now able to finance much more risky projects and therefore make projects possible which otherwise would not have happened.
Yeah, it seems like a financial construction. Rather than just pumping 20 million in investments in the economy, you can just put it as a guarantee and then provide 315 billion of investments, right?
Human experience says that the money is more wisely spent if you have to repay it.
Yeah.
And therefore, grants always have the risk of disappearing somewhere, while somebody who gets a guarantee or a loan will work in order to be able to repay.
You also touched upon QE making that you had to accommodate QE, right? Because you are the institution making the horse drink the water. How do you accommodate the transmission of QE into the real economy?
Well, QE, I mean, QE is just one acronym. The key thing was Mr. Draghi's unconditioned support for the currency when the currency was put into question. Whatever it takes. These are the three key words in the monetary policy of the last 10 years. Yeah. And this has, in my view, produced a miracle. So all of a sudden the money was there, but now you have to translate that monetary resource into real economy activities. And that takes somebody who does two things. Number one, has a close look at projects and analyzes good projects, whether they are good or not. If technically and economically feasible and sustainable, gives an approval stamp on these projects. By the way, not necessarily by economists and lawyers only, but by engineers. We are the most engineering-prone bank in the world. And when our engineers put an approval stamp on a project and say it's not only economically but also technically viable, then the private investors all of a sudden show up and say, okay, maybe we can co-finance. Yeah, and that is crowding in. And what we need in Europe and in the world, in view of the Sustainable Development Goals, is crowding in. We must get the private sector into financing projects of public interest. Yeah, and so you say during QE, the private sector is not really taking the opportunities, but low interest rates make opportunity costs for all projects, for all investments in Europe much lower, making private institutions much more willing to invest into the economy. Does this part of QE make your bank not rather unnecessary rather than more important, because private institutions do want to lend out to search for that higher yield, right? Yeah, but very often private institutions need that lead financing institution. Sorry? They need that lead financing institution. They need the one who moves ahead and says, okay, I give with my own resources a clear analysis, a clear due diligence of the quality of the project. And then the others come with us. When we have projects where you can say, why is EIB financing that? Can it not be financed by the private sector, by private banks, by others? Then I would recommend us to immediately step out. we should not try to crowd out private sector activities. No, the opposite is true. We should make sure that private sector is crowded into the financing of a project, and that is necessary also in terms of QE, because QE itself does not translate into the real economy. The problem with the monetary policy we have now, after many years of QE, as we had in the United States over the last 10 years, is that the transmission of a monetary impulse into the real economy does not work anymore. And during this period, we were the ones who, at least partly, were able to make sure that this translation of the monetary impulse in real activity was possible.
However, you mentioned that is this risk aversion that makes your bank necessary. However, we look at before the crisis in 2008, we see especially commercial banks taking these risks, and that was exactly what led us to big trouble. So this reason for your bank's necessity only is true when we are in an economic recovery or during a recession, when people are not taking the risks.
No, that would be good, and I would be ready to be the first to say, okay, it's time to shrink the bank, unless new challenges come to it, and the new challenges are obvious. It is the continuation of the climate change challenge that will remain. It is the continuation and aggravation of
the risk aversion.
Yeah, well, try to find people to invest into a climate change project, and you will have to overcome risk aversion again. The same is for innovation. I mean, sometimes we are asked to finance projects for the development of certain, let's say, pharmaceuticals, where you cannot be sure that at the end of the day, it will be a success. It is a high risk, highest risk project. On the other hand, we did a lot of financing in this field in the context of Ebola, for instance, and tuberculosis, with the support of the European Union, which again took a slice of the first loss. And therefore, we were able to finance projects which are definitely in the public interest, like Ebola vaccines, but which a private sector participant would not be able to finance.
Yes, and if we go back again to that difference in risk aversion in economic recovery versus in a recession, I would like to take the example of Italy, the financial sector of Italy, where there was excessive risk-taking before the crisis, leading to large balance sheets with non-performing loans. Is this not an example that the funding of your bank is just much more relevant during a recession rather than a boom? Because in that boom, for example, in Italy, there was excessive risk-taking by the private institutions, right? So that difference.
Yeah, it was excessive risk-taking. But risk-taking does not necessarily mean loss-producing. What worries me is less the risk-taking of Italian banks, but the probability of loans really not performing anymore.
Yeah.
And that is going to be the big challenge in the next years. We will still be needed tremendously in Italy because, number one, Italy is not doing enough in the field of research and development. It's not doing enough in the field of climate change contribution. And it has a huge problem with financing of SMEs. So we don't worry about losing business in Italy.
If I understand you correct, the difference between your bank's activities in Italy and the financial sector taking excessive risk is that they have a market failure and they don't take into account the bad loans, and that you, on the other hand, cautiously opt out investment opportunities, right?
Well, I think it would be pretty easy for me to criticize Italian banks. That would be too cheap. I don't do that.
But if it's relevant, it should be said, right?
They have gone through a very, very difficult situation, and recently, if you go back to the last 1 or 2 years, the government and the banking sector did some reforms that really hurt. And I'm wondering whether in countries where everybody always knows everything better, like the country I used to know best, and also the Netherlands, we would have had that courage to step in and be so clear on these reforms. They are not enough, that's for sure.
So you mentioned that in certain cases, your bank might crowd out investments. Which exactly, how do you, no, in which cases would you say, if this actually happens and you can notice it, would the lending activities for that sector, what area would that stop? As you mentioned, you would be the first one to support shrinking your own balance sheet.
Of course, I have the general philosophy, but that is, of course, a political orientation that I have, that says an intervention of a public institution must always be legitimized or justified. And the justification normally comes from a market failure. The market is not able to provide that project of common interest. And therefore, I think we should not be active in fields where there is no market failure, where we cannot produce additionality and give the entire exercise a European flavor.
Well, I think it's now a good time to move to the audience to see if there's any questions regarding the mission of the European Investment Bank and its functions, solving this market failure. Sarah is there with the microphone. Anyone?
See a question on the right over there.
Question on the right.
So more often than not, it's said that it's very difficult to reconcile social ends with profitability. And what I understand is that your institution sort of has a key capacity to sort projects out that are able to reconcile the two with each other. And what I would be interested in is there some common feature that you see in the project that makes them all possible to make this bridge between furthering social ends and being profitable at the same time?
Well, if you take the issue of social housing, for instance, this is something that the market alone will hardly achieve. So it takes public political intervention and a financing intervention. And there, the cooperation between the public institutions or nation states or communities and the bank, the public bank in our case, makes it financeable. It works. But I would go a little bit further in order to raise an issue that is extremely relevant for the next years. The EU Bank 10.5 years ago has developed and then issued the first green bonds, climate awareness bonds, they were called at that time. We were the first issuers 10.5 years ago, and we are still the largest issuer in the world. This market has now completely exploded. And it has been a big success to crowd in the private sector with this financing tool for the climate purpose. Now, last month I was with the President of the General Assembly and the Secretary General of the United Nations in New York, and we discussed the need to find new instruments to be able to finance the Sustainable Development Goals. The same thing. The Sustainable Development Goals are not per se prone to bankable projects. But we have all pledged, or all member states of the Union and the United Nations have subscribed in New York to go for these Sustainable Development Goals. So all the public money in the world, all the taxpayers' money in the world will never be enough to finance the project needed to achieve the SDGs. So we must find a way to crowd in the private sector. And therefore we need, again, this reconciliation of which you spoke, maybe in the field of more environment-related issues or in education-related issues. We must, expand this idea of green bonds into other spheres. Just give you an example on the most burning issue, perhaps infrastructure in Africa. The infrastructure needs in Africa are, as you can imagine, enormous. We are presently sitting or observing that hedge funds and sovereign wealth funds and others, insurance companies, are sitting on 66 trillions of euros that are tapped only for 2%, or next year we hope 3%, for infrastructure projects. So if we can raise that by 1 or 2%, the main infrastructure challenges for Africa can be resolved. But it takes now the development of the instruments to do it. And that's my most ambitious project I have for myself.
Interesting outlook, Mr. Hoyer. Yes. When we look again at Europe and look at the contemporary economic challenges that we face right now in Europe, you've always promoted the idea of a European monetary fund. This institution would act as a lender of last resort. But do we not need structural investment spending also in the good times, to close this investment gap that you just mentioned of 600 million euros?
You have understood the philosophy of my bank, so that's it's obvious.
Yeah, but we
No,
still
you're,
have the
you're
gap,
true.
right?
Let me begin from a different angle. What is going to happen with EMU, the European Monetary Union? That's the key question now. From the Juncker speech end of last year, or to the Macron speech at the Sorbonne. This is the key question. And you hear all things like the necessity to have a European or Eurozone finance minister or a Eurozone budget and all these things. What indeed is needed in order to make the Eurozone an integral part as a concentric circle of European integration is a backstop facility in order also to help states in times of trouble. And that is to a large extent done presently by the IMF. And the IMF will not do anymore very long. Because try to explain people in Indonesia or in Argentina why they should be now be asked to co-finance problem solutions in
should
Europe.
become more independent.
We
right?
must give the IMF back to the world and take care of our own problems. And this is why I think we need something like the European Monetary Fund. And secondly, you need an investment facility in order to attack the structural weaknesses of the European economy. Digitalization, for instance, is a desert on this continent in most parts. So, and that is a huge part for our lack of competitiveness.
That is European
Research and
Investment Bank,
development.
or?
And so you have the two institutions. You have ESM as the precursor of the European Monetary Fund, and you have EIB as the investment facility, which is already by far the biggest institution of that kind. You have to link it, however, and we are discussing closely with ESM how we can connect the institutions both without polluting the business models of the relevant other ones.
So you say we already have the institutions in place, we don't need new institutions for these challenges. But still, as we discussed, we have this investment gap of 600 billion. How are we going to fix that with the current institutions that we have at this moment? Should we increase your mandate, maybe?
No, the public cannot solve everything if the market does not go along. So that's for sure. What has been done is, over the soon 3 years of the Juncker plan, is to reduce the investment gap in Europe by 100 billion per year. So we are coming from 700 to 600. That is a huge success. And once the history of the European Union in this decade will be written, I think Mr. Juncker will shine very brightly, because that has been the main positive event. But we have to further develop it, intensify it, and first of all, give reassurance and certainty back to the people, because then they will go into their investments themselves.
Yeah, I think we can all agree that the Juncker plan did in fact work to boost that aggregate demand, which is exactly what we need in case of a recession. But then why not institutionalize something as the Juncker plan? Because one of the main criticisms of the Juncker plan was that it was too late. Why not have it already as part of the mandate of the EIB, so it's there in case of an actual crisis?
The Juncker plan was born at a moment when we had ample liquidity. 2 years before that, we had a critical situation that after the first wave of the financial crisis, the bank had exhausted its reserves, because there were so many suppliers to industry, for instance, and other companies who would have died during the financial crisis, that the bank had to step in. So the bank had to shed fat. The bank had to do pretty much, and at that time it was necessary to recapitalize the bank. We got the first capital increase ever at that time. So, and that did the job at that time. 2 years later, when we had the start of the ideas for a Juncker plan, the situation was different, because liquidity was not the problem.
Yeah, but we can come into a crisis or in a recession in the coming 10 years, and we'll be much wiser to be much more responsive, so that we have the Juncker plan already within the framework of the bank, that we can act much directer, right?
The Juncker plan has just been prolonged. It will go until 2020. Let's see what is going to happen behind that. That's, of course, a political question. The main thing is that we have to move from cyclical thinking to structural thinking. Our main weaknesses in the next years, at least, in the European Union, will not be cyclical, they will be structural. And we need to address these issues in particular.
Yeah, but if we talk about being in a recession again, which is quite possible in the future, we want to be more responsive to boost demand, right, or not?
Yes, the instrument is there, and the more you connect the ESM and the EIB, I think the more effective the whole thing will be. But I have the concern that our political leaders are immediately reacting to cyclical challenges, but not reacting to structural weaknesses. If I look at the financing of the educational system in most parts of Europe, it's a disaster. If I look at the digital world, it's a disaster. If I look at the translation of innovative processes in university research centers, companies, into products that conquer the market, we are not good enough. And these are things where we have to learn from others in the world and not only look at cyclical balances.
If we look at structural, we still have then the large investment gap of 600 billion. Okay, so if, for example, governments themselves cannot spend extra money because of the Stability and Growth Pact, so they're being restrained from more spending and closing that gap, you say the European Monetary Fund is for times of trouble, then you are the only institution who is able to close that gap, right?
I wouldn't say we are the only institution. I mean, we have national promotional banks, we have other big multilateral institutions, and the private sector can do much more as well. But it goes without saying that I urgently advise against reducing the activities of the bank now, because the worst of the financial crisis is over.
Yeah, but
would
okay,
be very short-sighted.
It should also be the private sector, but what we saw from the Juncker plan, it was a great combination of public and private sector working together, right?
And that must remain, and of course we are ready and keen to do that.
Okay, great. When we look maybe at other ways how the European Investment Bank could be even more effective in closing this investment gap, many prominent economists like Robert Skidelsky have promoted the idea of QE on investment spending. Rather than pumping money into the banking system, the ECB would buy cheap bonds at the European Investment Bank that in turn would lend out money for infrastructure projects and so on. Mr. Hoyer, would you believe that in times of crisis is a very productive manner to carry out expansionary monetary policy, apart from the fact that it might be difficult practically?
Although this was my research field as long as I was in the university, and I'm pretty tempted to comment it, I never commented on monetary policy. But I believe that we should return to the idea of the independence of the central bank. And the more we believe we can employ the central bank for cyclical purposes, for instance, or structural purposes, the more we get on the slippery slope. So I would be very careful on that.
But they would give priorities to your bank, and your bank is quite a technocratical institution, right?
That's true, and of course we cooperate closely with the European Central Bank, and we even have a direct line to the European Central Bank if necessary, but the good thing is it was not necessary, and it is good that it was not necessary because that is part of the trust building with the investors that we need every year for 70 to 90 billion euros. I want to avoid the impression that the bank would be in trouble and therefore need the recourse to the ECB.
Okay, I can understand your principles as well. It could be undesirable that just one organization is pumping out so much money into the system, but if you just, because you're an economist, if you just think about the concept, could it be very productive?
Yeah, but we have to be competitive. And we have to competitive in a fair environment. And if we get this kind of preferential treatment by the European Central Bank, I think we are distorting the market. Okay,
because then there are just being pumped up money into investment opportunities that would otherwise not have been invested in? Or?
I think this will not be the key challenge for the European Central Bank in the next years. The big problem of the European Central Bank in the next years is to withdraw gradually from QE and not to expand it. And this withdrawal from QE is the biggest challenge a central bank has ever had to cope with. And we see presently in the situation in the United States how difficult it is. A withdrawal from QE can destroy companies and state finances if it is done unwisely. But who tells you what is wise and what not?
Yeah, because interest rates go up, and countries that have leveraged themselves in times of the recovery then will become in severe difficulties, you think, or what?
Countries might become in severe difficulties, but don't overlook the fact that companies, productive companies, might be in difficulty. So
even productive companies.
Yes, a return to positive and growing interest rates must be done very, very, very cautiously and diligently. If that goes too fast, disasters around the corner. So I think monetary policy is nothing for the beer hall. It is needs to be in the hands of unfortunately very few wise people.
And you have the trust in Mario Draghi to complete this quantitative easing?
I have that trust.
Okay. Let's head over to the audience and see if there are any questions relating to the topics that we just discussed today. It could also be other topics that you feel we didn't touch upon but are really relevant to discuss with the President of the European Investment Bank. I see a question here in front, Sarah.
It works.
Yes. Okay. I remember you mentioned that the legitimacy, the reason why institutions should be able to have interventions is because of market failure, to avoid market failure. But at the same time, you said that European law is an important factor in deciding how interventions should be made. But how do you reconcile these two different components when deciding how intervention should be made by institutions?
To be honest, I have not understood that because I don't see anything that needs to be reconciled. Try again, please, because
the distinction between EU law, right? Could you repeat one more time?
Yeah, so in the end, you discussed how there needs to be the legitimacy of intervention by institutions is market failure. That was a statement that was made. And at the same time, you discuss how respecting EU law is an important factor that is a deciding factor in how intervention and how banks make decisions in regards to investing in other countries. So how do you reconcile the two?
I think it needs no reconciliation because it goes without saying that, at least for me, in a market economy, a public intervention is justified only if the market doesn't really work. If it works, and if it doesn't work, and if the public intervention is necessary and justified, then this must follow, of course, the legal system in which we operate, and that for us is the European Union. And I don't see there is a contradiction.
Okay, interesting.
Any
other
other
audience questions? I see one question over here.
Thanks a lot. So you discussed, I think the EIB is very interesting because you translate private capital, basically.
Talk a little bit louder, please.
Okay, sorry, thanks.
Yes.
You translate private capital at the EIB into projects that are invested in based on democratic principles. And you already discussed public-private partnerships as a way of getting the private sector into this. But in the past years, we've seen an ESG sort of movement within the private sector exclusively, without the public sector involvement. What do you see as a future for simply the private sector deciding to invest in like societally beneficial projects?
Then he would lose his job, I think.
Right? No, I'm very happy.
Yeah.
I'm very happy if the private sector takes more of the burden of producing these goods. I think that is very good. If it's socially acceptable, you always have the issue that the private sector goes into a market and roams the market. You have to make sure that A, it is socially and politically acceptable, and secondly, it is fair. I give you one example where one has to be extremely cautious. We financed in a big area of Congo and Cameroon a field, say a number of couple of hundreds of mobile transmitter stations These are simple lamp posts with a solar device on top, very small, 25 years without maintenance free. And with that, we simply transmit mobile cell phone impulses in an area where there is no electricity yet. Nobody has electricity in the house, centrally produced and distributed. Everybody has a little generator to charge up the smartphone, and to my big surprise, within a couple of years, 4.5 million people had a smartphone. For them, it was the first time in a very, very remote area, access to information via the smartphone, access to a bank account via the smartphone, which is important because in that part of the world, in particular, ladies are setting up small businesses. They need a bank account. The bank is 350 kilometers away or so. The first time, direct information via the internet to education, all these things. Now, that works perfectly. If you don't, at the same time, organize competition among mobile or cell phone providers, then you produce a monopoly, and this service will lead to people being really ripped off by this monopolist. So these things always go together, and you have to make sure that the competition then really works. But under these circumstances, I think one day in Africa, these things can be set up by the private sector completely alone.
I think this is also a pretty good example of crowding in investments, right? You start the investments and the other ones roll after.
Absolutely. I mean, sometimes you see investors there which you really don't want to have, but normally I think it is absolutely necessary because, again, the biggest challenge for the generation that is sitting here in this audience mainly is exactly how are we coping with the development challenges, in particular in Africa, and all the challenges that stem from that, from security to migration and what have you. And this is therefore extremely important to get this more on the screen, development finance in particular, but not only in Africa.
We have time for one more question. Yeah, the person over here.
With a white
sweater.
White sweater.
Yeah. Hi. I was very pleased to hear that you mentioned, I think, the 25% number on climate change related projects. I was wondering, was the transition from fossil projects hard, and are you still involved in, for example, gas pipelines and the traditional energy market?
Our eligibility criteria for energy are clear, and we are, of course, I must say really, of course, also financing gas pipeline projects, because you can be sure that the departure from fossil fuel will not happen overnight. And although I see the demand for gas in Europe shrinking in the next 1 or 2 decades considerably, the domestic production of gas here in Europe is shrinking as well. The coal production must shrink as well urgently.
Yeah. And in Groningen, for example, at this moment, right?
And if look at the situation in the north of this country, it is quite obvious that for a transition we will need gas supplies, unless we want to make ourselves completely dependent upon nuclear. And I don't believe in nuclear. That's a personal judgment, at least for the medium and long term. So we put everything we can into solar and wind and whatever we can. There is probably no windmill in the North Sea that is not financed by us. But at the same time, we need to organize and finance the transition. And for that, we need also gas. Our energy policy is emission-oriented and not energy source related. So we don't say no from the beginning to a gas project if it can be proven that it complies with the emission standards and the overall energy balance. If that is the case, we do. We have very critical projects presently under scrutiny. That's TANAP, the Trans-Anatolian gas pipeline, where we are in the decision-making process, but we have already decided on our participation in TAP, the Trans-Adriatic pipeline. It's extremely controversial, I know that, but I don't want to tell lies to the people and say we can live without gas in the next 10 to 20 years.
So before we conclude the interview, thank you for the questions again. Before we conclude the interview, we know you spent a large part of your career in the Bundestag, and therefore, as an insider of German politics, we would like to know your opinion on the new German coalition. Do you believe this coalition will be more progressive on Europe and will come up with concrete plans?
I definitely hope that whoever will govern in Germany soon will finally give a proactive response to Emmanuel Macron. I believe that it is not tolerable for Europe, not just for Germany, that we are out of that debate now for half a year and longer due to the campaign before. And therefore, I think we must overcome the standstill in Europe, and a government able to act in Berlin would be very helpful there. So it is not my political preference, but that goes without saying. It's not the key. The decisive thing is that there is a legitimized government in place who will take a much more active role on Europe than is presently possible.
So Germany's role is quite interesting in upcoming years. I wonder, do you have any interest in going back to Germany and building a more unified Europe from there?
I've the most fantastic job I could have ever dreamt of in Luxembourg, and I have no intention to go back into politics, which I deliberately left after 25 years.
I can imagine. So you seem to be quite optimistic about the situation in Germany. Well, you hope that the opportunity of Macron, that Germany will take that opportunity to further European integration. However, we have general elections in Italy in 2 weeks' time. In fact, we have an interview on this podium on Wednesday about this. What are your expectations for these elections, and what will be the implications, do you think, for Europe, in short?
It's difficult to say, but I can tell you my first experience when I became European Affairs Minister in 1994 was that I met with my Italian colleague in the so-called reflection group. That was a creative intellectual body that led later to the intergovernmental conference that produced the Treaty of Amsterdam. That went over 3 years and took me very, very often to all places in Europe, including Italy. And in Italy, it became obvious to me that nobody at that time was closer to the rather progressive ideas on European integration, which we had in Germany at that time, than the Italians. And I've seen Italy always as a driving force for European integration. And for the first time, I see the risk that might change in Italy, and that would be a terrible development. So whoever wins the elections, I hope and keep my fingers crossed that this fantastic country will stay close to us on the pro-European course.
Exactly. So for the people that want to know more about these Italian elections, make sure to come this Wednesday at 1 o'clock. We will have a discussion on the elections with 2 Italian experts. This brings us also to the end of our interview, Werner Hoyer. I want to thank you for sharing your time with us here today and coming to Amsterdam and sharing these great insights on the European Investment Bank. I have also good news for the audience, people who are interested in becoming interviewers at Room for Discussion themselves. If you've become inspired by interviewing economists or policymakers, which I believe you're both, right, Mr. Hoyer? Economist and policymaker, exactly. Make sure to apply before tomorrow, 12 a.m. at midnight. We've extended the deadline 2 more days. Without further ado now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to have a warm round of applause for our guest of today, Mr. Werner Hoyer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Great pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.